Hi guys. So we are going to be talking about nutrition. And the beginning of this is essentially talking about what nutrients are. So nutrients are basically substances in food. And those are needed for a few things. They're needed for growth, maintenance, and repair. So most of these nutrients are metabolic fuel. Some of them are essentially for cell structure and molecular function. So within nutrients, there's different classes of them. There are these things called macronutrients. And there are three main macronutrients, and these are large, and the word macro should help us determine this, right? So we're looking at things like carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. Now, micronutrients are small, and they're only in small amounts, and there are two of these. And those essentially are vitamins and minerals. Essential nutrients are nutrients that must be eaten. And these are ones that the body can't make. Or synthesize from other nutrients, right? And so there's somewhere between 45 to 50 nutrients that are considered essential nutrients, right? Non-essential nutrients are essentially also, they are vital to life. But if not enough is available, the liver can usually convert. So if not enough, the liver can make it. Right? And if you think about it, what else is essential for life? Water, right? So technically, by our definition, it would be considered a nutrient as well. And so when we look and we're talking about what we should eat every day, right? Essentially, the USDA has this thing called My Plate, and it's a guideline representation as portions on the dinner plate. So you can see each one of these is referenced. You have fruits, you have vegetables, grains, and proteins and dairies. And they're telling you about approximately the portion size you should have, right? And basic dietary principle says eat only what you need, right? Eat less overall, eat plenty of fruits and vegetables and whole grains, right? And avoid junk food, right? So though we like it, junk food is no. Now, when we're looking at energy value, because all of this has energy value when we're talking about it, it's measured in what's known as kilometers or kcals. And 1 calorie is essentially the amount of heat needed to raise the temperature of 1 kilogram of water by 1 degree Celsius. So basically, when we're talking about, or you see the big word calorie, that stands for 1 kilocalorie, not a single calorie. So it can be a little bit confusing here. And generally, people say that you should have a 2,000 calorie diet. That's an average, though, and that's essentially average considering age and men. And so it's different based on your age and your gender. So the dietary source is primarily from, so now we're going to talk about our macronutrients. And the first one we're going to hit on are carbohydrates. And basically carbohydrates, the dietary source is primarily from plants, right? So when we're talking about this, you can get examples of this. Starch is one example, and this is a complex carbohydrates. And you can normally find this in things like grain or even veggies. And that's like I said, this is a complex carb. Other thing that you might have, essentially, an example overall, when we're talking about carbohydrates, we're thinking sugars, right? And you have basically monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. And saccharides is coming from the Latin word that means sweet. And so something like a monosaccharide, you could find fructose, that's in fruit. Disaccharide would be something like sucrose, which you get table sugar, and polysaccharide is a perfect example of that starch at the top. A monosaccharide is also essentially glucose. And so you can find all this stuff in fruits or sugar cane or sugar beets, honey, and milk. Now within, they're also known as sugar or saccharides that are insoluble and soluble, and they're called fiber or soluble fiber. So insoluble fiber is basically something you eat that's called cellulose. And if you've taken a biology class, you know cellulose is what provides vegetables their structure. Cellulose is part of what's known as a cell wall in plants, and it makes it really rigid, or the outside being rigid. So your body can't actually break this down. So it's considered an insoluble fiber. Soluble fibers, a perfect example of this is pectin that's in apples or citrus fruit. And this essentially helps to reduce things like blood cholesterol levels. You can find a small amount of this essentially in things like milk or which is lactose. If you think people say that they can't eat lactose, that's actually carbohydrate, or even this thing called glycogen in meat, which is a really large sugar storage molecule that we use as well. That's made up of a lot of small monosaccharides known as glucose. Uses in body is generally for fuel, and most of it's used by cells to make ATP. Now, if we start when we make ATP, and we're going to talk about this using glucose, and it's converted to the storage molecule glycogen or to fat if we have enough stores of immediate sugar. Fructose and galactose are converted to glucose by the liver if we take those in and then into the circulation, right? Some cells do use fat for energy, but if you think about it, a lot of times when you're about to do a lot of physical activity, they tell people if you're about to work out to eat like pasta and things like that because it has simple sugars that are very easy to essentially convert into usable energy. Neurons and red blood cells use just glucose, don't use fat at all. So if you don't have enough sugar in your body to essentially eat, over time you will lose brain cells and they will quickly die without glucose, which should help you understand when you are studying a lot and you are craving things that are high in calorie or high in sugar like candy and pizza and things like that. It's because your body, and especially when it's using those networks in your brain, it's important that those cells get just straight simple glucose. Now, dietary restrictions, its recommended daily intake is about 45 to 65% of your total calories. Should consist mostly of complex carbs. So in here, we're talking about things that come from whole grain or veggies. You have to be careful because too much sugar can lead to obesity, right? As well as nutritional deficits, because if you're eating stuff that's high in sugar, it may lack substantial nutrients that you need outside of glucose, right? And American diet for glucose is somewhere about 46% are carbs. And the problem, you normally see higher percentages of this in low income families because these by far tend to be the most inexpensive. So that's the role of carbohydrates in our body. The next thing we're going to look at are going to be lipids, but we're going to do a quick review before we go into there. So if you see, you have summary carbohydrates. We should have about 130 grams of these, 45 to 65% of your total calorie intake. Out of that, about 25 to 30 grams of it should be fiber, helps keep you regular. Complex carbs, things that are called like polysaccharides, are essentially the things that you get from starches that you can find from bread, cereal, cracker, or flour, pasta, rice, or potatoes, anything white. Simple carbohydrates, sugars, they can be monosaccharides or disaccharides. You can get them from mostly disaccharides from carbonated drinks and candy, ice cream, pudding. Fruit, you tend to get monosaccharides from vegetables. You as well can get some monosaccharides, or you can get fiber essentially from veggies. If you don't have enough, if you have a deficit, you can get tissue wasting, which that's an extreme deprivation. So you essentially are starving to death. Metabolic acidosis can result from accelerated fast use. So you can actually, this is what happens if you don't have enough carbs and your body starts using fats to supply your energy. If you have too much, you can get things like obesity, which is the phenotype that you're overweight, diabetes, type 2 diabetes, nutritional deficits because you're eating too many carbs and not other kind of nutrients, dental issues, gastrointestinal irritation, and too much triglycerides in your plasma. So the next thing we're going to talk about is lipids and how lipids are used. So basically, the primary dietary source of lipids is this thing called a triglyceride. It's also called a neutral fat. It's most abundant. This is its most abundant form here. So basically, the examples that you have for triglycerides, you can essentially find these guys almost in any fat source that you have. So you can find them in meat or dairy or things like seafood, milk, which again is dairy, nuts, anything like that. So you have saturated fats and you have unsaturated fats. And saturated fats you tend to find in animal-based. Fats. And essentially what these are is when you're looking at the difference between saturated fats and unsaturated fats, it means that these have all the hydrogens they can on their fatty acid tails, and these do not, right? They have where you can add more hydrogens on there. So these saturated fats tend to be not very good for you. Unsaturated fats can be really, really healthy. And these are things that are plant-based. And so you see them in like olive oils and nuts or seeds. Most veggie oils have these as well. So they tend to be better for you. And these guys are generally liquid at room temp, and these guys generally are solid at room temp, which means that that's another reason why they tend to be bad for you, because these guys tend to be the ones that can kind of glop together and cause problems in your arteries. When we're talking about this, there are a bunch of different uses that you can have in your body for lipids. Essentially, they make what's known as adipose tissue. And adipose tissue is the fat that you have, and it's important because it helps for protection, insulation, and fuel stores. You also have what are called phospholipids, which is not what you saw before here. Phospholipids are a different kind of fat molecule that's important in the cell membrane. It gives the cell membrane the property that it has. Now, another important guy here is cholesterol. Cholesterol is a type of unsaturated fat. And cholesterol, you can generally find in things like egg yolks and meat, organ meat, shellfish, and milk. In here, the liver makes about 85% of your cholesterol. So you want to make sure that you're eating well-balanced meals that are not high in cholesterol. So cholesterol is important because, and the reason why we need it, it stabilizes cell membranes. So they allow essentially the cell membrane to stay fluid. On top of that, it's also a precursor to bile salt, which we talked about yesterday, and steroid hormones, because it does fit into the group of steroid hormones. So it looks a lot like testosterone or estrogen, believe it or not. Now, number 4 is prostaglandin. This is also a form of a lipid, and it's important because it helps to smooth muscle contraction. It helps with blood pressure control, and it is also important in inflammation. And we've talked about this a little bit before, that this, there's a COX-2 inhibitor when you take ibuprofen, and that reduces inflammation because it stops the formation of prostaglandin. Lipids are important because it helps you to absorb fat-soluble lipids. And it is also a major fuel for your liver cells, hepatocytes, and your skeletal muscle. So the American Heart Association recommends that you have about 30% of your meal or less of your caloric intake be from fats. Of that, less than 10% be saturated, and that you have no more than 30 milligrams per day of cholesterol. So that's about 1.5 egg yolks of cholesterol. So basically, you want to keep, really, your goal is to be less than 200 milligrams per deciliter. So this is the role of lipids. And so just to kind of go over these and kind of review really quick again, lipids can be both animal sources such as meat and dairy products and plant sources such as oils from nuts and seeds. Overall recommended daily allowance is about 65 grams. Less than 30% of your total caloric intake should come from them. Now, if you notice, you have different types of lipids on here. Linoleic acid is a fatty acid that you can find in nuts, seeds, and veggie oils. And then you also, that's the omega-6 and the omega-3 fatty acids you can find in fish oil and vegetable oils. And both of these are considered unsaturated fats, and they're very good for you. So the recommended daily allowance for the omega-6 is about 11 to 17 grams, and for omega-3 is about 1.5 to 1.6. And so both of those can help if you help overall. Essentially, if you have too much, say for instance, total animal fats, especially saturated fats, you can have obesity and a risk of cardiovascular disease, specifically things like atherosclerosis. You have the hardening of your arteries, particularly with excess of saturated and trans fats. And we didn't talk a lot about trans fats, but both of these are essentially fats. Trans fats are hydrogenated fats that we've made that essentially we've add hydrogens onto unsaturated fats and made them into saturated fats. So they're just not very good for you. If you reduce the amount of fats, you can get weight loss. Fast stores in tissue proteins start to be broken down to provide metabolic energy. The only bad thing is if you get to where you have not enough fat, you can have problems with not being able to control heat, because some of the heat that when you deplete that subcutaneous fat store, that's the fat that's right underneath your skin, it can lead to excessive heat loss because you don't have that insulation anymore. When you're talking about it being in terms of rules of these other lipids, if you have an excess in dietary omega-3 fatty acids, it can actually increase the risk of atherosclerosis. If you don't have enough, though, you can get poor growth, skin lesions, like eczema, and depression. If you don't have enough cholesterol, and cholesterol, you can get things like I said, egg yolks, or things like organ meat, liver, kidney, brains. If you have excess of this, it can actually increase blood cholesterol levels and increase LDL levels, and this has been correlated with a risk of cardiovascular disease. Whenever you get the possibility of not having enough, you can risk stroke in certain individuals, right? So cholesterol is important, though a lot of times you don't have to worry about taking a lot of it in because of the fact your body makes it. Now for the omega-6, there are no problems currently associated with taking too much omega-6 or not enough, just with the omega-3s. And that can be really, really healthy with things for like hair and skin. So let's talk about proteins here. So with proteins, primary source for proteins are animal products. So we're talking things like eggs, meat, milk, fish, and also you can get it from soybeans. Right? So you can get protein from both of these sorts. You have both what are called complete proteins and incomplete proteins. Complete proteins have all the essential amino acids that you need. Right? So example of these things would be things like eggs, or milk, most meat, as well as soybeans. Incomplete means that they lack some essential amino acids. And so you can think here you have legumes that are example here, sun nuts, and yeah. And so how would you essentially be able to get everything that you would need, all the essential amino acids that you need? Well, you would combine stuff. So you could take things like legumes and add them to cereal grains. And then together they would contain all the amino acids that you need. Now, they have both what's considered a structural component and a functional component to them on why they're important in the body. Structurally, they make up things like keratin, which is in your skin, collagen and elastin, which is in connective tissue, and muscles, right? Functionally, you'll find them working as enzymes and some hormones. Sorry, I think my pen just went out. So I'm just going to talk for these last few, and then I'll quit this one and start the next one. So functionally, they're enzymes and then some hormones as well. Dietary needs, they change depending on age, your size, your metabolic rate, and what's called nitrogen balance. Rule of thumb, though, you want to take in about 0.8 grams per kilograms of body weight. American diet provides more than needed in these. So, with this being said, I'm going to go ahead and stop here